What truly drives America's unique approach to the world stage, especially when it comes to human rights and global agreements?
It's a foundational question, really, and it constantly shapes our foreign policy.
Absolutely. And it feels particularly relevant right now. We see this playing out in the ongoing, sometimes pretty contentious, debate surrounding America's role in international institutions.
That's right. You might recall the U.S. withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council back in 2018 under the Trump administration.
Right. And our sources remind us that this wasn't just a snap decision. It apparently stemmed from, well, years of attempts to reform a body that many, including the U.S., saw as ineffective.
Ineffective and crucially plagued by what they described as an entrenched anti-Israel bias. That was a major point.
Yet after that withdrawal, former Vice President Biden pledged to rejoin the council, which kind of echoed the Obama administration's earlier approach, that eager engagement.
Mm-hmm. Although, interestingly, some of our shared material suggests that even that previous engagement, it yielded only marginally positive results.
Which does raise questions about whether simply rejoining is the most effective path forward.
Exactly.
So this whole back and forth really brings us to the core question for our deep dive today. Is the U.S. truly exceptional in how it handles human rights and international law?
Does it operate from a fundamentally different playbook?
And what are the implications, the real-world consequences of this distinctive stance, both for us here at home and for global cooperation?
So today, we're diving into the sources to unpack this idea of American exceptionalism in rights and foreign policy.
We want to explore why the United States often seems to diverge from international norms and what fundamental principles really guide its decisions on the world stage based on what our research shows.
Okay, let's get started.
All right, so let's unpack this with a basic question. Our sources highlight that the U.S. rights tradition is fundamentally different from other democracies. How deep do those differences actually run?
Well, what's really fascinating here is how the U.S. legally structures its core values. Our rights tradition, it hasn't just diverged historically, it seems to be increasingly standing apart from international human rights norms.
Okay, like how specifically?
Take free speech and defamation, for instance. The United States is far more protective of speakers' rights than pretty much any other liberal democratic state.
It's reductive.
Definitely. While countries like Canada, France, Germany, they permit punishing Holocaust deniers, and the UK has much stricter libel laws, here in the US, freedom of expression really has this pride of place.
So it's prioritized above other things.
It consistently seems to prevail over other important values, like fairness, equality, dignity, even health and privacy sometimes. It's almost treated as an absolute right in many contexts.
Wow, that is a stark contrast. So this isn't just a minor difference in legal interpretation. It points to something much deeper, philosophically.
Exactly. Our sources suggest that at its core, this reflects a belief in what some call the autonomy of the political.
The autonomy of the political. What does that mean exactly?
It means the state isn't just seen as a tool to achieve other ends. It's seen as its own cause, created by popular sovereignty with its own inherent value and identity.
I think Justice Scalia had a famous quote about this.
Yes, he argued very strongly that the Supreme Court should not impose foreign moods, fads, or fashions on Americans. It reflects that deep sense of self-determination rooted in our own constitutional framework.
Okay. Building on that, then, this view raises an interesting point. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the U.S. perspective often sees international human rights law as instrumentalizing politics.
Right. To instrumentalize something is to treat it just as a tool, a means to an end. So the criticism is that global human rights frameworks are sometimes perceived as reducing the maybe grander purpose of politics, creating a self-governing people with shared ultimate values, down to just ensuring individual well-being.
Which is different from...
Which fundamentally differs from a national political identity, where the state itself is seen as having ultimate values and purposes that go beyond just individual interests alone. It's a really basic disagreement on the very purpose of government.
Okay, so diving deeper into this unique stance, we see the U.S. has a remarkably distinct record when it comes to actually ratifying international human rights treaties.
Yeah, this isn't just an occasional thing. It's a consistent pattern that says a lot about the American approach.
So which treaties are we talking about?
Well, the U.S. stands out significantly for not ratifying key instruments that most other nations have embraced. Things like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, usually called CEDAW.
Which aims to protect women globally.
Right, from all forms of discrimination. Or consider the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC, which outlines basic human rights for children worldwide.
And the CRC statistic is pretty striking, isn't it?
It really is. The CRC has been ratified by every single UN member state except the United States and nearly stateless Somalia.
Wow, that puts the U.S. in extremely rare company globally. So what's behind this consistent reluctance? It's clearly more than just, forgetting to sign up.
Oh, definitely not apathy. One scholar we looked at, Moravsik, argues this opposition is often driven by deep domestic political divisions over social issues.
Social issues. Okay. What else?
Plus,
Eh,
a very strong tradition of states' rights, the idea that power should reside primarily at the state level, closer to the people. And then there's the constitutional hurdle, the two-thirds supermajority needed in the Senate to ratify any treaty.
That supermajority makes it much easier for opposition groups to block things, right?
Exactly. It makes it remarkably easy for what are often called veto groups to block treaties, even if a simple majority might actually support them.
And these veto groups, who are they typically? Our sources mention some specific concerns.
Yes, the sources detail that this opposition often comes from well-organized groups, like, for example, the Protestant religious right.
And their concerns relate to things like family structure.
Right. They express very real concerns that international treaties, particularly something like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, could potentially undermine the primary role of the family in raising children. They worry it might violate what they see as fundamental parental rights.
How so? What are the specific worries?
Well, for instance, worries that such treaties might allow children to challenge parents on various decisions or give children the right to view materials parents deem objectionable or immoral, or even, in some interpretations, possibly facilitate things like abortion without parental consent.
So these are deeply held values translating into political action.
Absolutely. And that creates formidable barriers to ratification in the Senate.
Okay, let's pivot now to another really stark example where America diverges significantly from its allies. Capital punishment. Our sources suggest this isn't just about different public opinion levels.
Right, and this is a critical point that kind of challenges the easy explanation. While historical polling data, interestingly, shows quite similar levels of public support for the death penalty in the U.S. and many European countries at the time they abolished it.
Similar levels of support.
Yes, but the policy outcomes were dramatically different. Consider this. Even today, polls show a plurality or even a majority of Canadians, maybe 70%, and Britons around 65–70%, plus Austrians and Italians, often around 50%, still say they favor reinstating it.
Yet their governments abolished it and haven't brought it back.
Exactly. In those European parliamentary systems, it was abolished despite that popular support, which really highlights that public opinion alone doesn't always drive policy outcomes.
So the key takeaway here isn't just the raw polling numbers. What do these contrasting approaches tell us about the U.S. system?
Well, what it suggests is that in the U.S., our federal system, combined with the extraordinary political importance of law and order themes, means that supporting capital punishment becomes a really potent symbol.
A symbol for being tough on crime.
Precisely. It's not just another policy position. It translates directly into voter support for candidates seen as tough on crime. It seems this intensity of preference among certain voter segments and its direct electoral impact is what makes the U.S. exceptional in keeping capital punishment, even when popular support might look similar elsewhere on paper.
It's about how those preferences get amplified in our political system.
That seems to be the argument, yes.
Okay, moving beyond human rights specifically, our sources also show a very pragmatic, national interest-driven side to U.S. foreign economic policy. The chicken wars of the 1960s seem like a classic example.
Oh, yes. A vivid example of economic unilateralism and, frankly, protectionism. Robert Fritz's interview details this perfectly.
His father was in the poultry business.
Yes, in Arkansas, and his company suffered badly from European competition. Fritz actually blamed the Marshall Plan, believing it helped European rivals who then undercut American producers.
So the chicken wars were basically a trade dispute.
At their heart, yes. A clear, generic issue, as Fritz put it, of American export promotion versus EEC protectionism. European producers were facing a flood of cheaper U.S. chickens, and they responded with tariffs.
And they claimed health concerns, too.
Famously, yes. They claimed American chickens, often grown with hormones back then, were unfair and unhealthy. But it was fundamentally a battle over market share.
And this is where Fritz's insight gets really interesting. He points out the underlying reality versus the official line.
Exactly. He notes that while the official European Economic Community, the EEC line, focused on health, the deeper reality was that the U.S. was, in his words, effectively destroying the EEC poultry industry with its super competitive exports.
It really shows that where you stand depends upon where you sit approach.
Absolutely. It wasn't about abstract free trade principles in that moment. It was about protecting domestic industries and boosting exports, even if it ruffled allies' feathers, so to speak.
And we see this pattern again, maybe even more dramatically, with the Nixon shocks in the early 70s.
Oh, definitely. The U.S. made a series of truly unilateral decisions that sent shockwaves globally, financially, and politically.
Like the opening to China.
Yes, the secret opening to China, something Japan, a key ally, had carefully deferred to the U.S. on for years. Then there was the sudden negation of dollar convertibility to gold, which essentially blew up the Bretton Woods system.
And the soybean embargo.
And the abrupt soybean embargo. All these huge policy shifts were made without consulting key partners.
It really underscores a foreign policy that, when deemed necessary, put immediate national interests first.
Even if it meant surprising and sometimes angering its closest allies. It was a very clear signal.
Okay, let's bring this back now to the heart of our news hook. That turbulent relationship the U.S. has with the UN Human Rights Council. Our sources offer a pretty critical view.
They do. The Heritage Foundation, for instance, is one source that describes the Council as consistently failing its mandate. They point to its politicized nature, its ineffectiveness, and what they call a persistent anti-Israel bias.
A major criticism often involves the membership itself.
Right? Yes, a significant critique is that its membership often includes governments with, frankly, deplorable human rights records. Countries like China, Cuba, North Korea have been members.
And the irony there, according to the sources.
The irony highlighted is that these countries sometimes receive fewer specific human rights recommendations during their Universal Periodic Review than the United States does.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The sources note, for instance, North Korea received 167 recommendations in one review, China 138, Cuba 148. The U.S., despite being a democracy with internal checks and balances, often received more recommendations in comparison during its own reviews.
That apparent double standard definitely fuels skepticism.
It certainly does.
And the real takeaway from this critique, this perception of bias and ineffectiveness, is significant. It helps explain why the U.S. actually withdrew in 2018.
Exactly. Former President Trump and his advisors explicitly adopted that America First sort of anti-globalist stance.
Didn't they describe the UN quite dismissively?
Famously so, describing it sometimes as just a club for people to get together, talk, and have a good time, rather than a vital forum for action.
And they even raised the possibility of defunding or withholding aid.
Yes, they raised the prospect of defunding parts of the UN and withholding aid from countries that supported resolutions critical of the U.S. or its allies. It was a clear signal of deep dissatisfaction.
Okay, building on that, it naturally leads to the question. If the body is seen as so flawed, what do some sources suggest as alternatives, rather than just re-engaging?
That's a crucial point emerging from the critique. Some sources argue the U.S. should actively look at alternatives instead of turning to a system seen as problematic.
Like using other parts of the UN.
That's one option mentioned, leveraging existing, potentially less politicized forums like the UN General Assembly's Third Committee, which handles social and humanitarian issues.
Or even going outside the UN.
Or, more radically, establishing an entirely new international human rights body outside the current UN system altogether.
And the idea there would be stricter membership.
Exactly. The vision for such a body would include very strict membership criteria to ensure it could focus objectively on promoting human rights without the kind of politicization, the bloc voting, and the perceived targeting seen in the current council. It's essentially a call for reform through creating alternative, maybe more effective structures.
All right, so to wrap up our deep dive, let's try and connect all these threads. The rights tradition, the treaty approach, the economic pragmatism, the skepticism of international bodies, to a broader philosophy of American foreign policy.
Yeah, one that really emphasizes national interest and, maybe above all, citizen protection.
Robert Fritz had a strong quote on this, didn't he?
He states it very unequivocally, quite powerfully, actually. He says, "The United States is by far the country which takes the protection of its citizens most to heart and won't sacrifice them to our foreign policy interests."
And he calls it a hallmark of American culture.
Yes, it's a hallmark of our American culture and what Americans expect. And he stresses this commitment extends even to citizens who maybe make bad decisions abroad. The U.S. government, in his view, remains fully responsible for their protection.
That's a very high standard for government responsibility.
It is.
And what's really remarkable is how this pragmatic realism, as you called it, extends to challenging some common idealistic notions in international relations.
Right. Fritz argues quite forcefully against the common idea that international understanding leads to peace. He says it's too seldom correct.
What examples does he use?
He points to groups like Israelis and Palestinians, Hutus and Tutsis, Serbs, Croats and Bosnians. He observes that these groups often understand each other quite well. They might share cultures, languages, long histories.
But understanding doesn't stop conflict.
Yet, he concludes starkly, they will fight and die to avoid peace. It's a really sobering, maybe even counterintuitive perspective on the roots of conflict and the limits of just achieving mutual understanding.
That does beg the question, then. If understanding isn't the key, what drives things? He even offers his own take on that famous Santayana quote about history, right?
Yes, the Fritz corollary, as we might call it. Santayana said, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. Fritz offers a provocative twist. Those who remember history too well repeat it on purpose.
Repeat it on purpose. What does he mean by that?
He argues that political meanings aren't always the same as moral meanings. Political goals and identities can become their own ultimate values, especially, he notes, under malevolent political leadership. It suggests a worldview that prioritizes practical national self-interest and a clear-eyed, perhaps pessimistic view of human nature over abstract ideals or a naive faith in global harmony.
So our deep dive today really reveals this consistent thread, this pattern in America's approach to the world.
Yeah, a distinctive emphasis on individual rights, but rights rooted very much in national sovereignty.
A pragmatic, sometimes unilateral, pursuit of national and economic interests.
And a deep recurring skepticism towards international bodies when they're perceived as politicized, ineffective, or biased against U.S. interests or allies.
This American exceptionalism, as illuminated by the sources we looked at, it profoundly shapes how the U.S. engages, when it withdraws, and what its priorities are on the global stage.
From fiercely protecting individual citizens abroad to navigating tough trade disputes, it's all part of that pattern.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to consider as you move forward. Does America's often unilateral and nationally focused approach, the one prioritizing its own constitutional rights and national self-determination, does it ultimately provide a necessary anchor? Maybe an example of robust self-governance in a complicated world.
Or, on the flip side, does its consistent divergence from international consensus risk weakening the very fabric of global cooperation? Does it undermine the push for universal human rights principles?
What balance, if any, should there be between that fiercely guarded national sovereignty and the aspiration for universal human rights? It's a fundamental tension, and it really continues to define America's complex place in the world.